Thank you, Rich. Ooh, plenty of volume. Delighted to be a part of this. I really am. When Rich first asked me about a year ago if I'd be willing to be on a phone call discussion with the organizers of this, I thought I was just going to throw out some ideas and that would be it. And as it developed, I was delighted that part of what was going to be included was a part on preventing wrongful convictions and remediating wrongful convictions, because that became a focus of my work during the last few years when I worked for the Attorney General's office here in Utah. But I want to introduce Kirk by letting you know that in 2007, when we were actually working on some legislation to allow people to get exonerated and to some extent compensated here in Utah, somebody mentioned to me that there's this guy who's going to be speaking at a federal defenders conference in Salt Lake. You might want to go down and listen to the presentation. And so I did. And at this point in my career, I had prosecuted a dozen capital cases, and I was about to hear a story that absolutely blew me away. Because if somebody had asked me, well, you know, what is the likelihood that somebody who was completely innocent, who had nothing to do, no connection whatsoever, didn't know the victim, there wouldn't be any other way to sort of insinuate them into the picture, that somebody like that could be convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. You know, you'd start off on the high burden of proof, we got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, the presumption of innocence. What's the likelihood of that happening? And to find out that it happened to Kirk, his conviction happened not just once, because after he had his first conviction and was sentenced to death, there were errors determined to have occurred in his first trial, and he had a second chance. To have one of those jurors, just one, say, I'm not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that this Kirk Bloodsworth is the person who killed this little girl. But it didn't happen. And he was convicted a second time. When I contacted Kirk, we had done training together, sensitivity training to the Utah State Bar, in particular to the Utah Prosecution Council, the largest annual conference here in Utah for prosecutors. We brought out Kirk, and I was delighted to be able to bring out Kirk to do that sensitivity training about 10 years ago. And then we also did the one for the bar. So when I contacted him, hoping that he would be willing to participate, I wasn't sure that that was going to happen. And I explained to him that this was an opportunity to speak at a nationwide conference. Prominent prosecutors from around the country who were interested in best practices, and that Kirk, in the end, was willing to come out for a fraction of what he was usually charged to speak, to participate in this. And not only that, he was willing to fly back from France at 3 o'clock in the morning, and well, it ended up being 3 o'clock in the morning, to come and address this group. So it is my very great honor to introduce my friend Kirk Bloodsworth to tell you a story that you need to hear.
You know, if you would have told me 25 years ago I would be sitting in a room full of prosecutors, I would say you were all absolutely crazy as hell. But as it turns out, you know, I have made friends with prosecutors and know them. I've just met several that are in this room, people that I've heard about over a period of time. So since there's a couple lawyers in the room, I'm going to tell you a story about the first lawyer I ever had. Now I want you guys to picture a prison visiting room with a glass partition. Your lawyer comes in off the street through an archway in the county jail, and it's 8 foot high and 10 foot wide. You know what I'm talking about. You sit in front of that glass partition, and your lawyer talks to you, and you have to talk on a phone, so you talk to the glass. And he sits with his back to a brick wall, and the first thing out of his mouth, he says, "Kirk, you're in a lot of trouble." I thought that was very astute of him right off the bat. And then it would get worse, but he said, "I know my way around the courtroom, and I know my way around the criminal justice system. We're going to find our way out of here together, Kirk." We talked about the case for about 20 minutes, one of only 3 visits this man came to see me in the 8 months it took to send me to death row. And right before he gets ready to leave, he reiterates what he said in the beginning. He said, Kirk, he says, look, I know my way around the courtroom. We're going to find our way out of here together. He put his hand on the glass to say goodbye, picked up his briefcase, turned around, and ran right in the wall. He was right, I was in a lot of trouble. But you know, back in 1984, I was an honorably discharged Marine with no criminal record or criminal history. I am not going to stand here and tell you that I was an angel, but I can tell you what I wasn't doing. And that was not killing a small child, and I want to get into that in a minute. I was newly married. I had never lived in Baltimore for about 30 days. I was married to this woman. She was a lot older than me at the time, and we got married in the spring of 1984. And I was a commercial fisherman back then. And my father was a fisherman, his father, and so forth. There's an island in it. I'm from Maryland, by the way. I now live in Pennsylvania, but I'm in Maryland, and there's an island in Chesapeake Bay named after my family called Bloodsworth Island. And, you know, we just were hardworking folks. I'd have to say, you know, a conservative family. You know, I believe back in those days that you got what you deserve. And, you know, my father was a Marine and, during the Korean War, and I went and, you know, followed his footsteps and went in the Marines, and I thought, you know, this is the way life was supposed to be. I was so detached from any criminal justice thing, I had no idea what I was about ready to fall into. I got married in April of 1984. My wife came down to the eastern shore of Maryland where I grew up and lived, and we had a place there. And commercial fishing is not something that you just go out for a couple hours and you fish. You know, this was 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and a half a day on Sunday to bait up for the next day, for Monday. And you did that all summer, you know, until about the middle or last of September, from May. And this was my life, you know. But Wanda, my wife, she didn't care for it much, and she didn't like the concept because I was never home, and we didn't get along, you know, at all at that point. We were really having problems, and so my uncle gave me a little bit of money, and I sent her, put her on a bus, I sent her back to Baltimore. Well, like any newly married person, you know, I was pining over her, and you know, I wanted to be with her. I was working. I just couldn't concentrate, you know. And so I took the little things I had and my clothes on my back and just hitchhiked to Baltimore, to a town called Essex. Now, Baltimore County, for the most part, I had never really understood what it was or what it was about. We were living in a small hamlet, and I was living in a house at the time with 7 other people, and you know, I was the only one working, except me and the stripper. She was working too. But, you know, I was working. I was a hard-working guy. I was just going to work every day, and my wife had gone. She was out all the time. And, you know, about somewhere in the middle of July. This was the 4th of July weekend now, in 1984, and I'm sitting in the living room with my wife, and we're watching the news, and this report came on the news about a little girl by the name of Dawn Hamilton who was found brutally murdered in a wooded area near her home. And a composite sketch came up on the screen, and my wife turns around and says, you know, that looks a little like you. And I was like, you must be absurd. This is crazy. What are you doing? And it turned out to be that composite sketch was made out of an identikit, which I won't try to talk about that. And so a search ensued, but at the same time, Wanda and I were having all these problems, and I just could not handle it anymore, and I went back to the Eastern Shore, and I was trying to get back on the same boat I was working on as a crab fisherman when I left. It wouldn't last very long. On August 9th, 1984, I got a big knock on the door. Open up, it's the Baltimore County Police Department. We have a warrant for the arrest of Kirk Bloodsworth. I went to the door and there was light shining in my face. Step outside, Mr. Bloodsworth. You're under arrest for first-degree murder of Dawn Denise Hamilton. And somebody in the back said, "You son of a bitch." They handcuffed me. I had a pair of silk running shorts on, no shoes, no shirt. And they walked me over to the police car across the stone parking lot, stuck me in the car, and that was the last time I seen my hometown of Cambridge, Maryland for 8 years, 10 months and 19 days. 2 years on death row. Now, they took me to the Raymond hearing, and I get there, and you know, the prosecutor at the time, Mrs. Schilling, I believe her name was at the moment, and they were just at me, man. I was you know, everybody was looking for me. And they were following this criminal profile that said this person, you know, what they thought this the criminal of this crime would be. You know, he'd be a white male between the ages of 20 and 25 years of age. I was 23 at the time, soon to be 24. They said he would have a love for water because this thing happened around a pond area. And, you know, I hope, just let me just, you know, say this, that she was found to be in and around in a wooded area near a pond. And I always figured, like, because I was a fisherman, blah, blah, blah. The problem with this criminal profile, the big problem, it was done by a police detective who had 14 weeks in a 28-week course. The other problem was that they didn't finish writing the report until after I was arrested. And, you know, when I was arrested, they called every person, every witness in the case and said, "Look, we're getting ready to have a lineup on this coming Monday. Don't watch television." And because we arrested the suspect. By the way, his name is Kirk Bloodsworth. It come to, it really did say that. And Monday shows up, and there was 5 identification witnesses in all. 2 little boys and 3 other witnesses, adults. Now, on July 25th, 1984, Dawn Hamilton had a sleepover the night before. She went out the next morning after watching The Facts of Life on TV, and her and her friends and her cousins that were staying over the night before wanted to go play hide and go seek. And Dawn was it. About a half an hour later, she couldn't find her friends. She came back to the house and told her aunt that was watching her that day, said, you know, "My friends are in the woods and I can't find them. You know, what am I going to do?" She said, "Go back to the fence line," it was near the woods or whatever, "and holler in the woods and tell them, you know, Aunt Sissy said, get up to the house now." About another half hour, the kids came back, but Dawn did not. She was found lying face down in a pile of leaves, naked from the waist down. Her clothes had been discarded in a tree nearby her body. And, you know, I'm telling you a story that I know every one of you in here have heard hundreds of times. And that Dawn was just a precious 9-year-old little girl with a page 4 haircut that never hurt a soul and was playing a game on a sunny, hot summer afternoon. That is what dishonorably discharged Marine was charged with, and they were seeking the death penalty in my case. I remember being interrogated by the police officer. I said, "Man, you people are crazy. I don't know what the heck you're talking about." I remember the case, it was in the paper, you know, and everybody was searching for this thing. So they took the 2 little boys and put them in separate rooms and gave them, everybody knows what an identikit is, right? It's a kit with overlays, eyes, noses, mouths, hairlines, jawlines, all that stuff, and different things. And the older of the 2 little boys, apparently, they had, the day of the murder, when Dawn was looking for her friends the second time, she had come across these 2 little boys that were fishing, and asked them to help her find her friends too. But on the rise of a hill area, right behind everybody, was this man standing with the sun behind his head. And he spoke up and said he would help her find her friends. Dawn leading the way and then following behind. And everybody wanted to search for this man. And this is what the 2 little boys, 8 and 10 years old, had said they had saw. They had put him in a lineup, and I was in this lineup. They had 6 of us. I was number 6, and they had 5 other people. One was an inmate from the jail I was at, and the other 4 were police officers. And now the description of this guy they said they saw was as follows: 6'5", curly blonde hair, bushy mustache, tan skin, and skinny. Now I can't jump off the stage, but I have never been skinny in my life. I mean, maybe when I was in the Marines, but you know, I weigh 200 and some pounds, and I'm 6 foot tall. I don't tan. I burn. This was, you know, this was just becoming more. And when I say my hair was red, it was red as that gal's sweater. You know, like a pumpkin. Nobody wanted to listen to me. After the lineup was over, the kids never picked anybody out of the lineup. It wasn't until 2 weeks later their parents called the Baltimore County Police Department and said, our children made a mistake. It was really number 6. The trial went on. The prosecutors, in my case, her name was Ambrose, and by all accounts, she was a very smart prosecutor. Robert Lazaro was the lead prosecutor in the first trial. She was co-chair. She would be lead prosecutor in the second trial. My trial lasted about 2 weeks. All these people, you know, pointing me out, except the youngest of the 2 little boys, never did in either trial. And I was sitting there listening to these people telling me, or telling the rest of the world, telling these 12 jurors that I had done this thing to this child. And it was, you know, my lawyer said, don't be emotional. You know, the guy that ran in the wall. Don't be emotional. Don't say anything. Don't jump up. And that's all I felt like doing. You people are out of your mind. Now, the homicide detective in this case had 25 years experience. His partner had 20 years of experience. There was 45 years amongst the 2 of them. 2 juries, very smart people. Some of these people were machinists and mechanics and just really smart guys and teachers and lawyers, I believe. People who worked for all sorts of firms, very smart, educated people in this trial. After the 2 weeks is over and the prosecutor looking at me and pointing a finger, don't believe Mr. Bloodsworth. Remember what the child said about the eyes? Well, when he did the photo array and took my picture before I went to Baltimore again, they put it in a photo array. I was the only one in the photo array that was taken inside. Everybody else was outside. The little boy stopped at my picture a little bit and said, oh, he looks like the guy, but his hair is too red. Cops just said, well, okay, that's him. In a roundabout way. They dismissed that. Red flag number 2 and 3. Now, you know, I never told a soul about anything about this case. Never knew anything about it. It was just what I'd seen on the news and seen in the paper. There was no physical evidence even remotely close to where I was at, except the eyewitness testimony. 85% of all wrongful convictions are based on that. Am I right there, Missy? I didn't know what to do. The prosecutor looked at me and said, he's a monster. You got to send him to death row and kill him for what he did to that little girl. The gavel came down on my life. The sentence was death and double life. The courtroom was erupted in applause. Give him the gas and kill his ass. What they said. They partied till 4 o'clock in the morning the next day to my execution. They handcuffed and shackled. My mother was crying in the front pew. My father tried to object. The lawyer, you know, the judge said, Mr. Bluzzer, shut up or get out of the courtroom. You know, I had no idea what this was happening to me. I went to one of the most notorious prisons in the United States, the Maryland Penitentiary at 954 Forest Street in Baltimore City, where a guard had just been disemboweled by a perceived insult from another inmate. Now, like I was telling you, there was no physical evidence. They had said I had made some omission about, you know, I'd done a terrible thing. Yeah, well, the terrible thing I'd said I'd done, I left my wife. We'd just been married. We hadn't been married for 6 months. You know, she wanted to go out to dinner and get a taco salad. That's what I told the cops. Never ever talk to police officers when you're arrested. I'm just saying. Shut up. It's not going to help you. So I wound up going to this prison, and they walk me up this causeway, and as soon as I get out of there, they say, Bloodsworth, we're going to get you for what you did to that little girl over and over for months at a time. He walked me down there in handcuffs and shackles, and he put me in a holding cell, which was the south wing, is where the guard had been disemboweled. And so they slammed that 300-pound door shut, and my life was over. I was 3 steps to the back door to the front of the cell. Both arms, I could touch either wall by going like that. This was my life now. And what a life it was going to be. I remember, and I don't have a whole lot of time here. Somebody can give me a track on the time, because I think I've killed the computer. Okay. So, I remember this place being, it was so bad. I got hit in the back of the head for a sock full of batteries. I got stabbed in the calf from a welding rod. I got hit in the chest with a master lock on a sheet rope, but I stood up. You're looking at the only cat who's ever charged with something like this that walked out in population. It's the Marine, and I just was not going to stand by. You're going to do something to me, do it to me, but don't do it to me because I didn't do this. This is what I kept telling everybody. Anybody who will listen. I used to write my correspondence. Respectively submitted, Kirk Noble Bloodsworth, A period, I period, M period, an innocent man. I used to write the prosecutor every Christmas. It's Christmas time, and I'm an innocent guy. Merry Christmas. I did. They got the letters at the courthouse. You can check. Time went on. 2 years had passed. The Court of Appeals overturned my case because they withheld exculpatory evidence about another suspect. This man was parked in a station wagon saying he was rolling up newspapers, and he's the one that found Dawn's clothing in a tree nearby her body. It was physically, he would almost had to walk over her to see the evidence. Because he was 2 inches shorter than me and 20 pounds lighter than me, what happened to the skinny part? They wouldn't put him in a lineup. And he said, it didn't look like me. This was my life. But the Court of Appeals didn't agree. Same people came to testify again in the second trial. This time I got double life. The judge just wouldn't give it to me. He used the mitigating circumstances of my young age. I was 23 years old. He knew something was afoot. Went back to prison. I became a prison librarian for 7.5 years, my last go. I read everything from Gestalt psychology to Stephen King. Don't ask me what that Gestalt book's about. I have no idea. And one day, I was sitting in my cell, the guards came by and put a bunch of books. You send a penny off or a dime or something to this thing, and you get these books, but I never sent it. It had my name on it. And I got these books in the mail, and one was about origami, and I didn't have time for that. And the one book that kicked in my mind was written by Joseph Wrongful, called The Blood. It was the first account of DNA technology ever used in a criminal case, and it happened over in England. To make a long story short, they didn't know who had killed these 2 girls over there. So they were looking for suspects. They DNA tested the male population of the town of Narborough, some 5,000 men. And they cut them in half because of the blood didn't match. And so the other 2,500 came back a blank. Alec Jeffries is the founding father of genetic fingerprinting. And this puzzled him. He worked for the genetics lab at the University of Leicester. 2 days later, though, a man was overheard in a pub in England bragging that he had took somebody's DNA test for him. And the person he took the test for was Colin Pitchfork, the first DNA person who was ever convicted behind the technology. And that is where my epiphany came. If it can convict you, why can't it free you? I remembered many spermatozoa seen in slides and swabbings in the police reports, the forensic information. slides, all these things. I wrote the prosecutor again, and I said, and her name was Ambrose at the time, and I said, you know, dear Ann, I'm not sure if I called her Ann or not, but I wrote her, and I said, I want to take this new test. It's genetic fingerprinting. She wrote me back a letter, and she said, dear Mr. Bloodsworth, we regret to inform you the DNA has been inadvertently destroyed. You know, I got really ticked off about that second. I threw all my stuff in a corner. I was going to light a match and set this whole thing on fire. I was so upset, you know. And then it hit me after the matchbook blew out that they didn't know where it was. So I got my lawyer. He's a judge now in Washington, D.C. He's the chief judge of the Superior Court in Washington. His name is Bob Moore. And he took my case because I had wrote a federal the defender, and who's in the appellate division, and he got him to come over there. They took my case. And I was talking to him on the phone. I said, Bob, and you know, this guy did know his way around the courtroom. He says, Kirk, I've already went to check. We've already checked into this, but they can't find the DNA. I said, Bob, you go back one more time, or I'm going to call you 20 times a day to collect. He accepted every one of my phone calls. So he goes back and he happens to look into evidence, wherever the evidence is supposed to be at, and he said he couldn't find it there, and he's getting ready to leave, and he happened to pass my law clerk in my second trial in the hallway. And he said, what are you doing here? He said, I'm looking for the Dawn Hamilton evidence in the Kirk Bloodsworth case. He said, well, I know where that's at. It was in the judge's closet, in a paper bag, in a cardboard box, sitting in the floor for 7 years. I finally had the evidence I needed. But, you know, this always gets heavy for me. My mother died 5 months before the DNA results came back. I was allowed to go see her body, handcuffs and shackles, for 5 minutes. She was the one that always told me that right was light. And don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And she hated me to be still. She used to say, don't sit there like a bump on a dill pickle. I remember coming back from the funeral home. I was there by myself with 2 guards with 9 millies. And I remember getting in the van, my priest was there with me at the time. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, and it was saying, stand up. And it got louder. The closer I got to the prison, it got louder. Stand up. And it got louder, and it's her voice. I could remember her calling me for supper for many, many times. Stand up. By the time I got to the jail, I was standing in a chain that run through the floor and the rings. I was pulling at it, and I was smiling. My priest was looking up at me like I was a crazy man. I knew something was about to happen. So, a guard stuck a Post-it note in my cell right around April of that year, of 1993. And it said, urgent, call your attorney. So I go to the day room, I call Bob Moore on the phone 1,000,000 times, collect, and he was screaming on the other end. He said, Kirk, you're innocent, man, you're innocent. I know that. When are you going to get me the hell out of here? Shoot. Going on 9 years, Bob. The DNA was tested by the FBI. That was our agreement with the state. If we have our examiner, and you know, Dr. Edward Blake was mine, he set up the FBI lab. Not only did they agree with my expert, but they also found another spot of semen on these underclothes of Dawn's that they said was no semen on in both trials. But yet they had a grease pencil circle around her underpant that said possible semen stain. They never checked. June 28th, 1993, William Sessions called he was the director of the FBI, and called Ann Brooks, Sandra O'Connor, not to be confused, that you better get him out of prison because you sent him to death row and he's an innocent guy. Now, I received a full pardon. Flash forward 10 years, I received also $300,000 from my trial. And no apology from nobody, not until 10 years later. I was sitting in my office and the phone rang, and it said on the caller ID, it said Baltimore County Government. You know, Dan, I thought the last time I talked to them, it didn't turn out too good. But I answered the phone, and it was the same voice that called me a monster in 2 different trials on the other end. Mr. Bloodsworth, I'd like to speak to Mr. Bloodsworth if I could. And I said the only thing I could say to her at the time, what can I do for you? Y'all thought I was going to say something else. No? She said, we have an update on the Hamilton murder, but I can't tell you over the telephone. So she said, I'll meet you anywhere in the state. So I met her at the Burger King. I like Whoppers. The police officers got me a soda. I thought that was cool. And we sat there, and she said they had a cold hit on a guy. That a police report came in about him 8 days before I was arrested, and they never went back to check. His name was Kimberly Shea Ruffman. And guess how tall he was? He wasn't 6'5". He wasn't even 6 foot. He was 5'6" and 160 pounds. Remember now, these were kids looking up at a man with the sun behind his head on an elevated position. Dawn finally had justice. I have been around the world, as Greg said. I have traveled everywhere from Japan to London and France and everywhere to talk about my story. To prosecutors, judges, defense lawyers, churches, everywhere I can for the last 25 years. And I have to tell you that I am not your enemy. I am not. All I'm saying is it's the bad guys that do the job wrong. It's all about integrity, folks. It's all about integrity. You know, when you do your jobs, it's not about getting elected again, it's about doing the right thing. I've heard it so many daggone times. You know, in my own life, my dad said, do the job right or don't do it at all. That was his motto for me. And I think that's the motto I want to pass on to you guys. In this life, when you do something right, you have to stand up for what you believe, no matter what it is. Even if it might not be popular, might not be the right thing to do, but it is the right thing in your own heart and your own soul. You have to get up, sit up, hold your head up, and never give up in this life. Do it for them. Do it for Dawn. Do it for the other wrongfully convicted people that you might not know at the time. But don't let nobody half-step. Take no 30-inch steps. Do it. And when you stand up and you fight for justice in your job and your life and for justice for your communities and your jurisdictions and your places that you work, stand up and do it right. And I want to tell you right off, when you stand up, turn around and don't run into that wall.